So as a couple more people are making their way in, I'll start by introducing myself. Most everybody I saw last week. I'm Faith Bandeput, and I'm your host this evening. And so I'm part of the organizing crew for the summit. So like to start out just saying thank you to all of our partners, all the crew that put this together, and to our sponsors. Just a couple little reminders: stay on mute, use chat for the questions unless our presenters ask otherwise, and just that this will be recorded. So in this virtual space, we'd like this virtual space to be a place that we have grace with each other. And to that end, our community agreements here are: we will actively listen and honor the experiences that others have lived. We will create a space that allows for learning and growth. This can be uncomfortable at times. And if there is someone who speaks easily, move up into a listening role. And if you listen easily, move up into asking questions. And we will speak only from our own experiences using I statements. And we all make mistakes, so we will acknowledge them and commit to change. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here and see all these amazing people here on my screen now. So thank you everyone for coming. And I'd like to start with, even though we're here on Zoom, I'd like to first honor these islands nestled in the heart of the Salish Sea. And we honor all the tribes who have ancestral ties to this land and to the surrounding tides. To those who have tended this land and these waters for thousands of years. And we recognize the rights and the injustices of the Treaty of Point Elliott and the subsequent violent displacement and settling of these islands. We honor the ancestral connection as alive in this moment and into the future. So we're very honored today to have Marco Hatch and Rosie Cayou, both of the Samish Nation, here joining us tonight. And as before, I'd like to start by introducing Sam Barr, who's going to again be our facilitator. So Sam is a native Lopesian, a Samish tribal citizen, a tribal historic preservation officer, co-manager of the Coast Salish Youth Stewardship Corps, and tribal canoe skipper. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Sam. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us again on this Tuesday evening. This week, we'll talk about clams and clam gardens, and I'm honored to be here in person with my Auntie Rosie, and I'm really glad that Marco could be joining as well. And so kind of the same thing as the last time. We can listen to the presentation and the speakers, and feel free to put questions into the chat box as we go, and then the session we'll have some time for conversation and all that. So thank you so much. I guess I will hand it over to the speakers, and Rosie, if you want to open us up tonight.
I am honored as well to be a part of such an important journey that you all have with one another. I look forward to the stewards handing over the information that they get as medicine to the future. Really proud that this is finally coming to light, what has been my concern for 51 years. My concern for 51 years. And the clam hole. You've dug a clam. You should leave the hole open. And I 51 years ago, I went with a marine biologist from University of Washington, and we dug a clam hole every 10 feet, and he'd bury the hole every 10 feet. And I thought to myself, you know, this is my job. I must not tell him he's doing wrong. Finally, I couldn't handle it any longer, and I explained to him that we don't bury our hole. And we went home, and I asked my dad why we don't bury our hole, our clam hole. And he said, because once we have buried a clam hole, we've disturbed their whole family. We've disturbed all the little babies that clam had, the little seed. And some of the babies rolled back into the bottom of that hole. We couldn't see. Then to go along and bury over on top of the babies, you're killing them. So that biologist wasn't able to bring that to light, wasn't able to get any scientific knowledge, only the traditional knowledge, so we weren't heard. Hoping that maybe at some point that will change, because we are losing our clams all over the Sound unless they are farmed, unless they are grown on a farm. The wild ones are getting extinct. You want to add to that, Marco?
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about that a bit later as well. But yeah, I always been curious about that. Why that's a rule. So what Rosie's talking about, it's a rule per Washington State Department of Fish and Wildlife that you have to backfill your hole, and when you do that, you're burying all these little tiny clams that are, you know, a few millimeters long under 6 inches a foot of sand or gravel, whatever it is, and you know they're all going to die, and so it's a pretty harmful practice.
You want to talk about some of the earlier times you were clamming, or how you learned?
How I learned to clam?
Mm-hmm.
I learned how to clam with a digging stick from my grandpa. We didn't have clam forks or shovels. We had digging sticks that was made from, maybe you would. I can't remember that far back. Learned how to dig them and dry them. And one time we had 4 buckets. And we went to Soxawaddle up by Darrington, way up in the mountains. And I asked Grandma where we're going, and because little kids usually don't supposed to ask. But I asked, and she said, we're going to Grandpa's cousin. And I said, oh. And we got there, and Grandpa's cousin wasn't there. So we stayed there for 2 weeks. First week, we cleaned the clams and dried them. And then the second week, he still hadn't come home. So we packed our things and came home, but that's how the old Indians preserved. They dried their clams. So when Grandpa's cousin came home, he's like 50 miles from nearest saltwater, maybe 60 miles, and Grandpa left him all those dried smoked clams that would last him all winter. Our old people don't do that anymore. I had the really good pleasure of going with my nephews. So I called Marco and some of my nephews. are somewhere in history, our ancestors were brothers and sisters. And that's how they end up being my nephews. I can remember one night going clamming. And my little grandson was learning. Only 9, 10 months old. And his dad fixed him a blanket and a bucket. And it was a nighttime tide at midnight. Put him in a bucket and he watched us dig by the gaslight. So the kids here, it's in their nature. Oh, it used to be. They don't dig clams anymore. And that's so sad. I'm hoping to bring that back as well. And I see it coming back in Sully. One day I'm just waiting for her to get in that clam hole and start picking up the clams. One time I got into a jaw fight with a goose. The goose was hissing at me and I was screaming at him. Or maybe it was her. But I thought she wanted my steamers and she thought I wanted her worms. And we were just about nearly wrestling. And I walked away, but she followed me. She would not let me dig in peace. Clamming during my life was a quarter of our food source for the winter. And year round, it was a quarter of our food source. And duck, maybe an eighth of our food source. But clamming and salmon were majority. Clamming, the old people used to string their clams, the little steamer clams, and they shrunk up and they'd get really dry. And we'd send the hunters over to Eastern Washington. And they went with their necklaces of maybe eight necklaces. That's how they packed them. Anything you've been interested in?
Have you seen the decline in the clams?
The decline in the clams is phenomenal. When I went out with Sam and Marco, it was a very, very, he almost did his happy dance from seeing so many clams. His Indian was real happy. And when I say that, his Indian, is that his ancestors live in him and they hadn't seen those kind of clams for a long time. So through Marco and Sam, the ancestors get to come back and be rewarded through their great grandsons being their instruments. And I seen the excitement like two little boys with those clams that day. We're going to do it again soon. I think it's really important that we need to be hands-on with everybody, not just Native people, everybody, so we can get some experience on how important it is to preserve that clam. There's the Cockle Clam, the little neck, the Manila butter clam, the horse clam. that my people ate. And they only ate the tongue of the horse clam, which was about maybe 6 to 8 inches long. And they pounded that bivalve and they dried it. No, it was nutrition again. Nutrition and what is protein? Another thing that we ate that is related to the area where you'll find a lot of clams is the sea urchin, right out of the shell on the beach. Just crack it open and eat it right there. The clam is the most important one to us. Any questions, Marco? How about you?
No, it's good. Just I think yeah, you and Sam keep having a conversation, and then I'll jump in after.
Okay.
Let's see here.
Prepping.
Oh yeah, how to process and stuff. Yeah.
So when we were prepping clams, you take the butter clam, for instance, and you take it and you go straight down the middle of it. And you don't need to throw away all the clam meat, just the black part. The black part is the waste. In fact, I was just telling Sam earlier that how we could tell where the butter clam was as a whole bunch of long little poops around the hole where it gets rid of all of its waste. And that's what the black part is. You can eat the whole rest of the clam. Too many people think that they're just supposed to eat the ribbon. Take that and you can put that, this only in the last maybe 70 years, the natives have been doing it like this. They bread it, they turn that butter shell, that butter clam upside down so the shell's like a dome. And then they steam it in its, after you have maybe put some, a long time ago, the old Indians used dried moss for their breading, and like seal oil or some kind of oil that came natural. Steamer clams, of course, we only did it one way, and that was steaming it. A long time ago, when there's no pots available, they were, if it happened to be this time of the year, or even if not, some people carried around their skunk leaf cabbage leaves, and they wrapped their seafood in that and put it under the hot rocks around the fire. Otherwise, they used their baskets. Now, how do we cook in a basket? Does anybody have an idea? Mm-hmm. How do you steam clams or boil clams in a basket? You want to answer that, Sam?
You drop the hot rocks in the water.
Yeah.
Watertight grass or bark basket, and you just put the hot rocks in. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then they're rotated. You have a huge basket, you line it with rocks. Mm-hmm. And then you put your food in there, your duck, your clams, your salmon. You have 2 fires going. one for the to keep boiling, another. Now how do we do that? I mean, one to keep, both of them to keep the hot rocks in. Then they're dropped into the basket of water and they're boiled up. Every time it stops boiling, you rotate the rock until it's all cooked.
Yeah, and then the pit bake is still something we do. But we just use the canvas now.
Yeah, you want to explain that one?
Yeah, so we can a traditional way that to cook the clams that people still do at big gatherings and events, like on canoe journey. So we dig a big like trough or like a short ditch in the sand on the beach, and then you throw a bunch of big rocks in the bottom of the trench, and then start a big fire on top of them and cook. Just kind of start the fire on top of the rocks and get those rocks really, really hot. And then you let all the wood burn down until it's just like white ash and the rocks are like white hot. And then you just throw the clams right on top of that. And you cover it with a piece of thick canvas cloth that had been soaked in the seawater. And then there's enough steam, and it's like salty seawater steam that's created and it's held in by that canvas that you just steam and cook all those clams right there on the hot rocks on the beach. And then it's like the perfect serving tray also, and that like keeps them warm. And so then you can have, like 100 people come up and eat from that big, like platter, like this big platter that's dug into the beach. And then when the tide comes in, it just washes all your dishes. So it's a pretty great way. Wow. And then this is
an example.
This is an example of what a cooking basket would have looked like. So it's coiled grass that can be woven so tight that it's waterproof. And then the way that works is because when the grass soaks up the water, it expands a little bit as it swells up. And so if you weave it tight enough, when the grass expands, it becomes perfectly watertight. And then you just drop the hot rocks in there. And yeah, this is amazing.
So these two baskets, I want Sam and Marco to know that you're always welcome to use it for display or storytelling, or, I have two of these. These came from Scott Chat.
Oh, okay.
He found those. These here supposedly were found out at Bayview, maybe deeming them Samish, the Samish area, like where I think your people come from there, Marco. Do you have any idea if they're from the Bayview, Edison area? They are from the Samish tribe, Samish Island area?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
And Sam's people are from the Orcas Island area.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow, that is
wow.
Yeah, it is.
So maybe, Rosie, while we have you talking, we'll take a look at the chat. Someone asked, why are the clams declining?
I'm not a scientist, but I've worked with scientists. And some of the scientists that I've worked with, we're easily convinced as to why the clams are declining. And that's because there are so many public openings for clam digging. But what do they have to do when they dig a hole? They have to rebury it, therefore distorting the whole clam family and killing the babies, the little tiny seed. So I think we're over harvested in some areas. Penn Cove has had their beach closed for 3 or 4 years now. So I'm hoping maybe that's the reason, was to get their numbers back up.
Has Fish and Wildlife changed the practice? What would it take to make a change?
I have no idea what it would take to make that change today. We tried back in 1970. But like I was stating earlier, they had no proof that the clams were declining, but there's proof today.
Someone asked about dropping hot rocks in it. So you have a fire with big rocks in it, and then as the rocks heat up, you use like a pair of tongs, like made of wood, and you can grab the hot rock and put it directly into the basket that's full of water. Then all the heat from the rock dissipates into the water. And it's actually, I guess I actually heard about this study where they actually had like a comparison between a stove and the hot rock method. And the hot rock method actually heats water up faster than an electric stove top. But
and it
doesn't
cost nothing.
Yeah, but you gotta factor in the time of starting the fire though. But once the fire is going, it heats it up faster. Someone said that in New England they had clam bakes like that. They suppose they were taught by the first people there. Someone asked what kinds of grasses and materials are used to make the baskets.
So you can answer that one.
Yeah, so sometimes they're made from sedges, because sedges are really, really strong and really plentiful in wetlands, and they grow back really well. And then people will also use roots, like the little teeny, like hair thin roots. Well, not hair thin, not those ones, but like the little tiny ones that are like a centimeter thick from cedar trees or spruce trees. So they'll find like an uprooted tree, and then you'll harvest those roots and split them, and they'll get really, really thin, and they're really straight and strong and really small. And yeah, it's the kind of weaving is a coiled basketry, which is all around the world, but Coast Salish has really unique designs, really amazing designs, and people use cherry bark and different colors of grasses to kind of embellish the baskets. And this one is a really big basket. It's pretty good size, and it's been sewn in the bottom. It's really hard to tell, but it looks like it's been used because the bottom wore out, and then someone's has sewn the bottom back together. You can kind of see that. And so that makes me think that this was a real basket that was used and not just a decorative basket, because later on after contact, tribal peoples sort of realized the economic viability, and people started selling these as pure decoration and not just utility. But the decorative ones were usually smaller, and they weren't used and sewn back together like this. So this is probably like a real Indian basket that was used by people. You can tell
where it was sewn back together.
Yeah.
But what did they use for the sewing?
Yeah, they used cloth. No, that's just cotton thread. Yeah. So this is like kind of, yeah, it's like just in the transition time.
Yeah.
You know? That's amazing. And I can't tell if it's bark. It might be bark even, because it looks really strong. How like polished that is.
Well, Sam, I want you to take this here home to be your to be your companion.
Inspiration.
Yeah.
Thank you, Auntie.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
I can't gift it to you just yet because it was a gift to me, but I want you to take care of it.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Oh.
There's 1,000 memories in there. Millions of memories. There's ancestors witnessing this today.
And then someone asked about red tide, if there were red tides when you were young.
No red tides. The first red tide that I ever witnessed was in probably 85. I don't know how far back. We didn't even talk about it with the doctor from the university, the marine biologist. We didn't even talk about red tide then. And that was in 70.
Were there certain seasons that you harvested and certain seasons you didn't harvest?
No, we harvested year round.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yep.
Even at midnight.
Even at midnight. You remember Isaiah?
Uh-huh.
He was the baby that was in the bucket.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's great. We knew it was little. Okay. Great.
Anything else in there?
Nope, that's it. We're all caught up. Maybe, did you harvest mussels?
Yes, we did. The wild mussels were plentiful out in Penn Cove.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for those.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes, I'm sure you have a good place for that.
I actually just harvested a bunch of sedge grasses.
Oh, yeah, that could be a great model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Where was the best clamming, real fast?
The best clamming, I mean, this is not something that we share. But the best clamming is where Marco and Sam and I went. You could turn over 6 or 8 clams in a dig in certain areas there. And the next best clamming would be on Whidbey Island at Penn Cove. They have their beaches closed right now. They say for pollution, but I believe it's just for, it's for restoration. It's harder to say, it's easier to say pollution to scare people off than it is to say restoration.
Yeah, when
so
one of my,
on this clam fest, go ahead.
Oh no, it was just one of my friends who does a lot of traditional plant harvest. People always ask him where, and he always responds, "I go to my spot."
Over there.
Yeah, I go to my spot over there.
Got to learn how to point with your lips.
Do you want me to talk a little bit about some of my stuff, or?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, please.
Okay, let me. I feel like it's an abrupt transition, and I apologize because I feel like we should all be sitting around eating clams, looking at that basket. But instead, I have a slideshow, which is not nearly as engaging.
And we will do that, Marco.
Soon, yeah.
Yes.
Our tides are coming up.
Yep. And invite from over there. Invite from the screen here, from Zoom here. Keep in touch with Marco when we're going to have a date.
Yeah, one thing, Rosie, you taught me a long time ago, which is if you hear about it, you're invited.
That's right.
Because people are always nervous about going to stuff, unless they get a proper invite. But if you heard about it, you're invited. So
Yeah.
I like that one. Where are we? I like to start my talks with this image, and in the spirit of Thomas King, from The Truth About Stories, is that the truth about stories is that's all that we are. I also like to start with this story originally from Chief Dan George, about trees and canoes. And it starts that long ago, when a family needed a new canoe, they would meet with the community carver. He'd ask the family what the canoe was for. Would it be for long trips or short trips, to visit family, to go up the river, to move through the islands? And after learning what the family needed, and understanding that the family had good intention, the carver would go in the woods and look for the perfect cedar tree, have a conversation with that tree, which might take days or weeks. And if the tree agreed, it would be felled and carved into a canoe. And now we no longer have those large trees that you can make a canoe from a single tree. Now, often when we make a canoe, we need multiple trees. We need 2 trees to come together to build one canoe. And the process of conversation with the tree and paying respect is still the same. But now we're melding 2 trees to make one canoe. And those trees have independent personalities. They have they're different trees. But when they come together to serve that greater good, to help that family move through the islands, they need to come to terms with one another. They need to understand one another and respect one another, even if there are things they might not agree about. And it's important because if they don't come together, there's tension in the canoe, and that will cause cracks, and eventually the canoe will split apart and the people will fall in the water. And we can think of that now as those two canoes, as traditional ecological knowledge is the old way, the traditional way, and the other canoe is our modern or Western science. That we need both aspects of both of these knowledge systems to move forward, but we need to come to terms with one another and form a mutual respect. And you can think of that canoe as the sailor sea, and us as the inhabitants of that canoe. And so if we want to move forward to have the healthiest environment possible, we need to use all available information, and we need to respect one another and respect that information. And this image comes from a youth canoe trip we were involved in, my lab was involved in a few years ago now, with Lummi youth. And there's a wide variety of people from different tribal nations, of non-natives, coming together to help these youth on their journey, to help carry the canoe to the water so the youth can go out and do the work they need to do. And I think it's a nice way to start. I'm going to talk about a few things, one of which is Clam Gardens, and I'll come to some of the prefaces of that as it relates to the San Juans. But this is an image of a clam garden that's been restored. This bottom image, this is Jefferson M. He's Urington Paiute from Shears, Nevada. Grew up a farm boy, but so we gave him a pitchfork and had him clear seaweed for us. But this rock wall has been restored, and this is that rock wall that defines a clam garden. A clam garden is effectively a terraced beach where you can roll rocks to the low tide line and take a steep beach and flatten it out and increase the area for clams, the area for clams to grow in the exact location they want to live. I often refer to this as the Goldilocks zone. If clams live too low on the beach, they get eaten by sea stars. If they live too high, they dry out and die. And so there's a very special spot that clams are really happy in, and these clam gardens extend the amount of area there. And it's a feature that's been seen up and down the coast, and that's been increasing more and more interest in communities reinvigorating this technology. So the same way that we've seen reconnections around weaving, working with materials, canoe journey, language, we're seeing a reconnection around tending the beaches. And clam gardens are one very visible way of doing it. It's not the only way of doing it. It's just one particular tool that I've been looking at for a few years. And this is done in the context of our, maybe the framework that's been created by academic legacy, which is this quote from Introducing Anthropology. This is from 2008. The quote's still the same, and the latest version I can find, which is 2016, which is the Aquaculture society was so populous due to the abundance of natural resources, especially the annual salmon runs, when in essence the food resource came to them. And to me, like, thinking about that quote helps explain many of the reasons why a lot of our ecosystems are the way they are now. When we talk about the way that we tend beaches, things like that, is that, to me, what this quote's saying is that populations were so high because of this natural abundance, and individuals, communities up and down the coast pre-contact that didn't have to engage in any complex resource management. They didn't have to have a reciprocal relationship with nature. They didn't have to tend. That in this case, it's painting this picture of the Kwiaht people being very passive. And it's that legacy that we're still dealing with now, that negative legacy of, nature is natural because people are removed from it. And the only reason that there were native populations were so high was due to no fault of their own. It was just this natural abundance that people did not have to have complex societies or complex interactions with nature. And so this is still pervasive in a lot of our natural resource management. And it's something that we're trying to work against. And I think Clam Gardens, one thing that's attractive to me is they offer a very tangible, visible counterexample to this, to say that, yes, populations were quite higher than I think we realized, but that was due to a very complex societies that were engaged in complex management in agriculture that hasn't been recognized for a long time. So when you look at a feature like one of these clam gardens, this one's in the Southern Gulf Islands, it's over 1 kilometer long, 20 feet wide, and just in front of Nathan Cardinal here, who's standing here in the kind of hero pose from Parks Canada, that wall drops off to about 10 feet below water. So we're talking about monumental rock features. We're talking about more rock than Stonehenge in a single feature. And there's untold tens of thousands of these up and down the coast. And so it was clearly not a passive activity. It was clearly an activity that required a lot of time, energy, and care and engineering to both create, maintain, and manage these structures. And so the abundance of the resource was not due to accident. It was due to very active participation in environmental management. Today we call these biocultural seascapes or landscapes. We could talk about the same thing with camas and a lot of the terrestrial plants as well. I'm a marine person, so I think about clams. Clam gardens range from here through Southeast Alaska. This is the different language groups that traditionally that manage clam gardens. And our oldest ethnographic information around clam gardens is pretty interesting. It's from Stern, 1934, Lummies of the Northwest. And there's not a known extant, there's not a known clam garden feature in the state of Washington. However, our oldest ethnographic information comes from Washington. It says on a place called Yulong on Orcas Island, there was a clam bed cultivated by its owners, they took the largest rocks that were in the clam bed and moved them to the extreme low water mark, setting them in a row like a fence along the edge of the water. Now, stir 1934, the word clam garden really hasn't been around that long. It sounds like a clam garden to me. It sounds like people are moving rocks to the low tide line to build what looked like a fence. It said this made clam digging very easy compared to what had previously been there because there were only small pebbles and sand to dig in. It's exceptional to cultivate clam beds in this manner, while other clam beds were used by everyone in the tribe. Here, the owners who cultivated the bed gathered from there. So it's a, something that we would think of as, a lowly clam in the mud. There's this massive amount of work going into maintaining and cultivating clams, as well as a complex system of societal norms and regulations around who, when, how often, all of these aspects that come into play with harvest. So counter to the prior quote about, just massive environmental abundance and to, sort of no fault of their own. It's a massive amount of work that is on display here that it took to build these. And look at just trying to show a few images of clam gardens to get you familiar with them. They all look different. There's no one feature that we can quantify as a clam garden, and it's quite difficult. It's like one of those things where if you identify plants, like you kind of get an eye for it. It's kind of similar. That takes a while to be able to detect what we're looking for, but frequently it's a large, these are very large rocks. Many of them are much smaller. Many of them are like kind of small basketball size rocks. I know there's not a small basketball. I don't know my sports, but sort of that smaller than basketball sized rocks. This one's adjoining bedrock, which is pretty frequent. And there's a nice flat beach here. This is in Bella Bella in Helsick territory. This one's in Quadra, in the very north end of the state of the sea. And so same sort of idea, there's bedrock behind this image, some bedrock poking out, and then a pile of rocks here. And one thing that you have to think about as well is that these features, many of them haven't been maintained for 80 or so years, that it takes a lot of work to keep the rocks back in the wall. And so they've kind of spread out a bit. This is one from John Harper, who's a geomorphologist who his job was to basically fly from Washington to Southeast Alaska and code all the beaches. And he helped the kind of reinvigoration of clam gardens by noting these features up and down the coast, and knowing that they didn't exist due to glacial events, to natural events. This is another feature on Quadra. And again, it might take a nuanced eye, but this is one wall. This wall was built about 3,500 years before present. In Quadra, sea level's been dropping. Isostatic rebound is outcompeting sea level rise. And so isostatic rebound is, when there was a mile of ice over this area, ice melted, and then slowly, as my geology prof talked about it, similar to when his uncle Eli sat on the couch all day and got up for Thanksgiving dinner, the couch would slowly kind of rise back. The same thing is happening with isostatic rebound. The land is bouncing back. And so in this case, we're looking at a feature that's 3,500 before old, right in front of Nicole here. And this lower one is about 12 to 1,800 years old, but not, here's kind of this is a tumbelow, so it's open on both sides, but more of a nuanced feature from farther away. And now we're going to look at two features from Google Earth. We often do scouting by Google Earth, but it's not 100%. One feature, just for scale, is going to be here in Russell Island, and the other feature is going to be up here on Quadra. And it's interesting that there's a number of features through the Southern Gulf, and as I mentioned, we haven't seen it, and there's not a publicly known extant feature in the San Juan Islands. And so spend a bit of time for this because I'm happy to get coordinates and thoughts via email. And I tend to spend a fair amount of time bumping around here for work and pleasure. So we'll look at, I think, yeah, Russell's coming up first. And so when we look in Google Earth, this is actually post-restoration, what this clam garden looks like. And so pre-restoration, it was even harder to see. And this is post-restoration. This is after a few years of moving rocks and rebuilding this feature. And it's quite low. And if you're looking at it saying, I don't see anything, that's probably fair. But what I'm looking at is you see bedrock, 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 and a straight line. And here that line is probably mostly from the waves breaking up on that line. It can often frequently be from seaweed, but we typically don't see straight lines in nature. And so anytime you see a perfectly straight line, it's a reason to kind of pause and wonder what's going on here. This next one is much easier to see. This is called the orchard site on Quadra Island. Really, this is if there was ever a stereotypical, like this is what a clam garden is, it would be orchard. Bedrock, bedrock, and this rock wall drops off. It's probably 8 feet tall from this piece of sand here to the upper piece of sand. It's very striking, very long. And this beach is massive. So really, really big site. So in some of my work, this is from, it's actually my father. This is from Bella Bella, Celtic territory, working with the band. They're interested in how clam gardens function. And so we did an experiment where we tagged hundreds and hundreds of butter clams, where we dug them up, glued little numbers on them, wrote their number, measured them, and then let them grow out. And this is an individual that grew out all summer. So this lighter shell is what grew while it was in the experiment, and this darker shell is a pre-experiment size of the clam. So you can see a fair amount of growth on that individual. And what we found is that it was pretty interesting that this is tidal height along the, sorry, I apologize for the graphs. This is tidal height along the X, and along the Y is effectively growth rate. And here are high tide, and this is low tide. And so what we found is as we move like up and down the beach line and think about how that impacts clams, clams are filter feeders. They live in the water, and they're lower on the tide line. They're underwater more often, so they can feed more, so they can be fat and happy. When they're higher on the tide line, they're not underwater as much, so they have less time to feed. They're typically less fat and happy. And we see that in the red dots, the non-clam garden, that the clams that live lower on the tide line grow faster and they're fat and happy. Clams on the upper part of the tide line grow slower and they're less happy. When we compare that to the clam garden clams, there's not an impact of being high or low on the tide line, meaning that in a clam garden, you can have these clams that are quite high. And there's a couple examples that we went to where these, it's hard because the tide datum in Canada is different in addition to the meters feet thing. But probably what I would call in the US datum, easily a +3, if not a +4 tide height, was just full of butter clams. And if you're a clam digger, you know, like that's really, really, really high. And one of the highest, it's not one of, it's the highest abundance of butter clams I've ever seen was in that location. So what it's doing is it's mitigating that stress from being high, which is cool and interesting. And you're like, okay, clam is happier. But what we haven't done, which is something I've been wanting to calculate, is you only dig clams when they're out of the water. And so if we move the distribution of clams, 3 feet higher on a tide line, how many more days of digging does that open up, right? When we're thinking about the beach as a grocery store, as Rosie said, quarter of your food could come from the beach, and it's only low tide a certain number of days out of the year, the grocery store is effectively closed the rest of the days. And here, if we can move it up a little bit more, it's probably doubling the amount of days available for digging, which I think is pretty interesting. We also see totally different sediments in these features. So in the clam garden, we see this really white shell, kind of broken up shell hash. And in non-garden areas, it's more of that muddy, you can see a bit of eelgrass in there, sediment. And I think that kind of back to the why has there been decline, I think that this is probably a lot of it as well, is that one thing that we have now is more sedimentation. We've got more runoff. Stormwater is the largest source of pollution in Puget Sound. And with all of our development, we're having more fine grain stuff wash in, organic matter, and that's suffocating the beaches because people aren't digging and tilling them and turning them over and helping that small stuff flush away. That could be a big piece of it as well. Just the compaction in addition of organic matter. I'll skip this one I'll say really quick. This is non-clam garden, this is clam garden. So about 4 times as many butter clams on a garden and about twice as many little neck clams. So lots and lots. And some of these features are tiny. That's Paul there for scale, and that's Ed, shoot, I'm blanking on Ed's last name. That's a Heltzik guy, clam digger. Yeah, I'm blanking on his name. But tiny, this is, you can see how big this is. I mean, Paul's a decent sized human, but it's still only, if he's laying down, 2 paws wide and 6 paws long. Or these tiny little bites, and there's a small wall here and a small wall on the other side of Ed Carpenter. And this beach is all crushed shell and is full of butter clams, and very, very high on the tide line too. This is Yao Bay, just north of Bella Bella. Really pretty spot. And so when we think about this interaction of people and nature, I think, there's maybe the gut is like, well, people harvesting can decrease abundance. And what in some of our work we're trying to quantify and argue is that people harvesting increases abundance. That in academic speak, we call it coupled human natural systems. But if we have a feature, this is Clam Gardens, it can be a camas bed, it can be any clam beach, and people are actively managing it, digging it properly, respecting the beach, only taking a certain amount, removing the large ones, like in Rosie's secret spot. I actually looked it up. Sam got, I can give away the measurement of 74, I think it called it a 74 millimeter Manila clam. The biggest record I could find was a 76. That was a big clam. So, at a certain point, you have to start removing, making space for new ones to grow. People are interacting with the beach. They get benefit from it. Indigenous people are, when we're out on the beach, it's that what Rosie talked about, that reconnection to place and spirit, and practices that, Sam and his daughter out there, teaching multiple generations how to care for these beaches has a massive human benefit, has a massive benefit to us as a people, as well as it has an ecological benefit as well. By digging those beaches, by removing certain clams, by not backfilling the holes, fine grain sediments being washed away, the organics are being washed away. It's actually increasing the overall amount of clams, which then is increasing the biomass of that beach, which makes it better for people to go back there. And so it's this positive feedback loop where when we're out, tending the beaches, they do better, and it makes it more there's a bigger draw, there's a bigger, I don't want to use the word reward, but there's more clams in your basket at the end of the day if you're out, taking care of these beaches properly. Rosie mentioned a couple of these clams, so I just want to show pictures of them. The little necks and Manila clams, these are introduced. They're quite pretty. This is a native little neck, even though it has the coloration, it has the little ridge there. The Cockle Clam, which are I think they're one of the most delicious. They live in the shallow sediment, bucket of butters, and a big horse clam. And some work from Julie Barber, who works for Swinomish. She's their lead shellfish biologist, looked at clam populations through time. And this is for, I don't know what it is, 10, 11 different locations around Puget Sound, looking at little neck clam abundance. And so this is a relative index, plus meaning there's more, negative meaning there's less, and there's a dividing line here, and then time. And these are just the different location codes. I have them if you want them, but it's not super critical at this point. But what is important is that in all of these sites, there's a downward trend. And it's interesting to think about why that is. And there's a few things that come to mind. One is, this is already a shifted baseline. This is already starting in 1990, and assuming 1990 was pristine, right? Well, that's not true. So if we had this graph and went back 300 years ago, what would that look like? And then two, like what could be going on here? Harvest, for sure, maybe in some locations, but I think a lot of these locations are not dug, particularly when you combine that with 73% of the tidelands in the state of Washington are privately owned. And are inaccessible. Even many of the public beaches are inaccessible. And so we start to think about the barriers to harvest as well. I think that the addition of sedimentation, of compaction, of beaches not being dug are all big players in here. And those are things we haven't really quantified, that we don't really know. And I like to draw the analogy of a beach and your raised garden bed in your backyard, right? You don't just throw some carrot seeds out in your raised garden bed and come back 10 years later and see what's going on. You're out there, multiple times during the summer, pulling weeds, pulling out the big carrots, making space for the little ones. Every spring, you're adding new soil, turning it over, adding compost. You're actively managing that raised garden bed, because if you take care of it, if you tend that garden bed, you're going to have more vegetables at the end of the year. The same thing is true for our beaches. And we're in a situation where, for a whole host of reasons, people are not digging clams as much. And so we're effectively not tending our gardens. And so if anything, I hope that we start to think about ways to increase clam harvest done respectfully and correctly, because that can improve the overall ecosystem. Clams aren't just food, they're filter feeders, they're helping clean the water. Other things eat them as well. And they're just a cool thing that I think we should have lots of them around. And I'll wrap up here with, this is some work from Jamie Donawadu. She also works for Swinomish. And this is from one of her papers on the Indigenous Health Indicator, which is a way of looking at health, not from a purely like Western medicine standpoint of your blood pressure, heart rate, et cetera, but a way of including things like intergenerational knowledge transfer, what it means to be people, sense of place and belonging. And the first quote's, like we say, it's our spiritual food, so it feeds our soul. It might poison your body, but then we'd rather nourish our soul. And this is in reference to someone who has a seafood allergy, but they'll still eat some clams and then take medicine to come around to counteract it. Next one's, whenever there's a low tide, you can go out and get clams. It's kind of virtually that you would expect to have for your children against another piece of our culture, lost, that if lost couldn't be undone. And so the role of clams is very important. And as we're moving forward, there's lots of legitimate barriers to why we're not digging more clams. Like I mentioned, 73% of the tidelands are privately owned. Tribes that are eligible under the Bolt and Rafiti decision are allowed to harvest on private tidelands, although that doesn't mean that the property owner is not going to come chase them off and cause a confrontation. Red tides, we talked about fecal coliform bacteria, persistent pollutants, industrial pollutants, creosote, things like that. And then more so what I hear is just the perception is like, we just don't know. Like, it's scary, all the stuff that we put into Puget Sound. And so it's kind of scary to think about eating something that is the filtration system for Puget Sound. And so the not knowing, I think, is a big one. And I wish we had better information around that. So that's all I really want to leave some time for questions. So say, Haishka, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. That was so great. I've got a picture that I wanted to show real quick. Maybe I will share my screen really fast. Yeah, so when we just went out and went clamming, this is what the beach looked like when we were done. So I think a lot of people kind of go out there and they dig this hole that looks kind of like a 5-gallon bucket. Like they'll just dig straight down and they'll have like this little like big can of, but in this spot, just because of the way that Auntie Rosie harvests and turns the soil over, it almost like encourages the clams to be closer to the surface too. And so we kind of just like dig almost like a little trench, like you just take a scoop out and turn it over, and then you kind of go down in a line, and then you kind of have these little piles of dirt that build up, and then these little depressions. So it almost looks like just a little mountain range kind of thing, and it's very different than the way that, like Marco was saying, like a fish and wildlife officer might instruct you, and then we never fill them in. And but I mean, the tide comes back in and does its thing, and the clams seem to just love it. And so I just wanted to show people a picture of what that looks like in a beach that's just right around here. Yeah, and this is actually Samish owned property near March's Point. You can see the refinery in the background there, like we were just talking about pollutants. But
the refinery is one of our biggest supporters for clean beaches. So I'm not worried a bit about them at this point. I worry about the creosote out there. I don't know if they've ever changed their pilings or not. I haven't noticed for a while. So I wanted to ask one question to Marco. At Crescent Beach out in Orcas Island, now what is the beds like out there?
Where's Crescent Beach?
It's just right beyond the town of Orcas, in a little cove.
Down at East Sound.
Yeah, East Sound.
Oh, I've not been in there yet. Oh, Crescent Beach. Okay, yeah. Ship Bay. Don't they grow oysters right there? Yeah, there's a small oyster farm there.
Yeah.
I haven't been on that beach. I've driven past it because of the oyster farm there. I wasn't sure what was private and what was public, but I guess it is.
Oh, yeah. I did see people digging there one day, though.
Oh. Yeah, it looks like it's sand. Yeah, I know it's sandy up top. I haven't dug that one.
So do you know this guy named Lerner from out there?
No, not by name, no.
You might be interested in meeting him. He's quite a farmer himself out there with the ocean.
Cool.
I'll send you his name.
Yeah.
I don't think so. Awesome. So it looks like there's a couple questions. Yeah, you see it there?
Yeah. So start with Kevin Murphy. Seaweed Harvest is one that there's some folks that do it. It's one I've wanted to do more. Do you ever harvest seaweed, Rosie?
When we were young, we did it, and as the red tides got closer, and Dad feared the seaweed getting as much pollution.
Was it black gold?
There's just no seaweed to harvest anymore.
Yeah. Was it black gold, the little ones you dry?
Like the bladder rack, like that stuff. Those little ones.
No, it doesn't have the bubble in it. It's porphyra, but it's like thin and kind of curly. It's on the rocks.
Okay. I think that's the stuff. That sounds like the stuff my great grandmother would talk about a lot. Granny. Yeah. She was always looking for the black stuff that grew on rocks.
Yeah, and she said she hadn't seen it for about 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So last 20 years it declined.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't personally know anybody down here that does it. I know up north it's huge. It's real
in Bella Bella.
Yeah, big time. Yeah.
Was it in Bella Bella or Bella Coola?
I was in Bella Bella.
Oh, so you met the Browns up there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, a lot of Browns.
Yeah, I had they had a jar of black gold on their dinner table. You put a little bit on everything.
Yeah.
So if we're looking at non clams associated with clam gardens, there's one paper looking at infaunal diversity, meaning they took cores and counted up all the little worms and stuff and found more in gardens. I have a student, she's Chuck Chansey from California and married to Paul Klein from Lummi, who is finishing up her work on the Southern Gulf, looking at that rock wall that's built, all the other animals that live there, chitons and red sea cucumbers and other food species, and finding that these features have a lot more of that compared to other areas. So there is a big benefit in addition to clams, there's having that rock wall, and we didn't even quantify, there's tons of seaweed, there's lots of other things that are growing there too. A question about the Bolt decision. So the Bolt decision was for salmon. It's the Rafiti decision in, I think, 91 or 92 that enforced shellfish. So there's a couple different layers of that question. One is like legal versus allowed. And so Samish is not, were denied rights under the Bolt decision. Other tribes that are able to exercise those rights. And Rosie, I'm sure you have experiences of this, of still people getting chased off different beaches. And Washington has a weird system where 73% of our tidelands are privately owned. When I go to Canada, I think most of your islanders, when I go to Canada, I'll roll up on our little tiny research boat to a small island that one family owns the entire island, sort of maybe a Vindovi-sized, even smaller than Vindovi-sized island. And the landowner will be out there on their tractor, cutting the grass, and they don't bat an eye when I pull up and wander around on the beach because the beaches are public. Where you can imagine if I did that out here with some of the landowners might not be as friendly to me, even though I'm driving my research boat. So this perception of owning of the intertidal is a big issue.
I wonder if we could get Rosie's opinion on kind of owning tidelands and what kind of cultural perspective of that is.
I'm kind of involved in a little group out here at Guimas that the spiritual part of walking a beach is to finish your journey and not be stopped and have a gun pointed at you and told to turn around. One of my beliefs is that water owns that beach to the high tide mark. The sea spirits on that beach. We're trying to get the law turned around out here to where anybody can walk around the whole island at low water. It's very, very disheartening for an older person like me to see the birthplace of her grandfather have these kind of laws.
I like that it's the sea that owns the beach. Mm-hmm. It's not us.
Yeah. The water spirits.
Mm-hmm. Marco, is there anyone in the States that's doing clam garden restoration?
Yeah, so let me double check it's public here. I'm certain it is, but I just want to make sure. So I think there's been some articles about it. Yeah, so Swinomish is looking at creating one as a tool to use both in the face of rising sea levels, but also as a tool to use to just reinvigorate that technology and to be able to have more community connection around it. They've been working closely with the BC tribes, the Hokomie and Wasanic, around the restoration they're involved in, and they're trying to figure out, how to do it and where to do it. So there's one group that is. It's a big permitting issue. Anytime you're putting stuff in the intertidal, it becomes a big issue around forage fish spawning areas, eelgrass habitat. If you tried to put in, shoreline armoring, these features would be lumped under the same permitting process as shoreline armoring. Now, I would argue that they're fundamentally different, but by the letter of the law, they're not. I don't know where they're at in the permitting, but I imagine that's going to be a pretty big hurdle.
So I have one question for Sam. I wondered about the Stillaguamish and where is their rightful place to gather their shellfish?
That would be around the mouth of the river, like Port Susan Bay and stuff, near kind of by Kayak Point. Yeah, around there. But yeah, and out on Camino Island.
Like
there.
by the state park or?
And then Penn Cove also, I think that it's not very far. It's only like from the mouth of the Stillaguamish River, it's probably less than 2 hours to get to Penn Cove. Visit the relatives over there. And I think, like you were saying earlier, the ability to process the clams and travel with them, if there was a really popular spot and you had family connections, I think they'd probably go to Penn Cove too. Yeah, but
Snateland Point.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, like Stillaguamish now will come up, and we've brought them out to the Samish-owned beaches and kind of had cultural days together there. Do you have a good cockle recipe?
I don't. I don't know if Marco does or not. I don't. They're a little bit too muscly for me.
So to me, the key is not to overcook them. Just steam them until they pop open.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're sweet. They're really, really sweet.
Yeah.
And another question here is, how seriously should one take red tide warnings, and why are they so prevalent nowadays?
That sounds like a scientific question.
I follow them 100%, but it's tough because so you'll have a bay that's closed because of red tide, and in that bay there'll be an oyster farm, and they'll be operating, and in that bay there'll be a Manila clam farm, and they're operating. Different species take up biotoxins differently, and they hold it differently. If you ever did clams, the one I would never eat is a varnished clam. I think they're just disgusting, and they hold toxins way longer than any other clam that we have around here anyway. So you could have a red tide 9 months ago, and that varnished clam will still be toxic today. You see them in the market. They're called Savory Clams, I think. They harvest them from Hood Canal. Taylor, I think, will dig them on public and sell them. So I always avoid those. I know some folks that will dig a horse clam and just eat the neck, and there's probably good data that the horse clam neck doesn't build up toxins, but I wouldn't. The other thing that's interesting about, or I'd be cautious, the other interesting thing that's different between Washington and other areas is in the state of Washington, those closures are dictated by the Department of Health. The Department of Health is not a legal entity that can close or open shellfish beaches. That's only WDFW. So beaches can be closed, and you can still legally harvest them. And I've done it for bait, and people will freak out and come down and try to stop you. But you're with good intention, whatever. But you're getting clams for crab bait. In Canada, they use temporal closures and just close it for most of the time. But it's hard. Last year, because the fisheries were closed because of COVID, and then lately we've been seeing red tide starting darn near this time of year and going through November, December. And that's likely due to increased nutrients coming in, and then stability of the water column, which has to do with rising temperatures. But we're seeing them definitely earlier and later in the year than the past 30 years, 40 years.
What about the moon snail?
Oh, Guanasnusi.
Yeah.
That's what Ed called them. We had one of the guys that was working with us that would always run into one every beach we went to, and so he nicknamed that guy Guanasnusi, which is it's a literal translation of moon snail in Celtic.
Guanasnusi?
Guanasnusi, yeah. Nusi's moon. Guanas must be snail. What about him?
I just wondered that there's warnings about moon snail all the time, and I don't even know what it is.
Huh. Yeah, I've never seen anybody eat one. They're quite large, but I don't know. I think they show up in the record, in the archaeological record.
Huh.
There's a question about other responsible clam harvest practices. What are some other tips? Like always bring your shells back to the beach.
Yes. With all clams, you return your shells back. But mostly the butter clams were cleaned right there at the beach, because maybe they got some babies on them yet, That's all I can remember from when I was a child. When we brought those clams up to Sauk Mountain, there was a lot of clams, or shelled bucket clams, buckets full of shelled clams. We stayed there and dried every one of them, because they had to be shelled right at the beach. So it's a traditional practice.
Are there some ways that people can support efforts to make beaches public? Is there any kind of political movement for that, or Marco?
I was just looking for a picture of two of my students holding a moon snail. I was reading up on the public trust doctrine, and it hasn't been well decided in the state of Washington, and it's looking like the most recent case law example is pro-private property, and it's explicit about whether public trust doctrine, meaning that you could cross from public land to public land, specifically beaches, public beach to public beach. You could go from public to public and cross private. It doesn't mean you can stop and like dig clams and like have a beach party on private tidelands, but you could cross private tidelands for the express purpose of going from public to public. That hasn't been very well litigated. So if anybody's a lawyer that wants to take that one on up, I think there's some communities that are doing some really cool stuff around community-supported aquaculture. Drayton Harbor's Oyster Farm used to be that way. The Squaxin Island, I believe, is the ones they're doing it with, working with landowners around seeding beaches and then making those beaches available for tribal members to harvest. I think that's good. I think you could think of ways on a community level scale to do that, right? To think about how to have informal ways of increasing awareness and access to private lands that aren't being dug in a way that's kind of good for everybody.
Mm-hmm. How do you think climate change might impact clams?
There's I saw there's a fair amount of ocean acidification talk in the chat. So yeah, OA is a big issue with mostly when the shells are floating around after they've been spawned. That's a big issue. As sea levels rising, we're going to lose habitat. The other concerns a bit around just the warming temperatures have started to kind of put things out of whack a bit. Clams spawn typically at a certain temperature. So they wait for the temperature to get to a certain point, and then they all broadcast spawn at the same time. And as that temperature is coming earlier, the environment might not be ready for them. And so they're spawning too early in the year. That could be another issue.
And then Rosie, how do you dry the clams if you're processing them for smoking or drying?
When I was a child, my grandfather used to make his own sinew. And that was out of the innards, the belly of a seal or a deer. And he cured that sinew, and he strung it, and they hung it in the longhouse all along where you've been to those longhouses. And they just hung them and let them dry there.
In the smoky rafters.
Yeah.
And then we've done that recently with some youth groups and stuff too, right? And how do we do it nowadays?
How would we do it nowadays? I have a smoker in the back. We have a smoker over at the RV center. We should actually spark up that smoker and get some put in there. Once they're cooked, and then you put them in for smoking and curing. It should be preserved for a good long while. That's what skunk cabbage leaf was used for, was preserving dried salmon and clams. Indian Reynolds wrap. When I talked to you earlier about your Indian, you know how you just have to have that taste of clam? That's feeding your Indian spirit. There's a lot of people that say that, you know, like, let's just go to Iris and get some clam chowder. It's not the same.
No, it's not.
Got to go dig your own and cook your own.
Yeah. I'm going to share real quick here, just because it's one of my favorite pictures and I found it. How do I make it bigger here? That's a moon snail. That's one of my former students from Northwest Indian College and one of my students at Western, but they found a moon snail and did a lot of selfies with it.
Wow.
And then they wound up winning first and second place. And I know they won two different categories, first in two different categories at SACNAS at a conference of 4,000 people. But it's my proud dad brag.
That's great.
4,000 people?
Yeah. Yeah, it's we did good. Yeah.
I did a Catholic conference once, and I catered 1,500 fry bread and clams. There's a lot of Catholics there.
Well, it looks like we made it through all the questions, and we're right around 7:30. So, yeah, I'm really thankful to Rosie and Marco for sharing everything that you did tonight. I learned a lot. I learn something every time I sit down with both of you, and I hope everyone else learned something too tonight. And yeah, do either of you have any closing words or just want to say goodbye?
Well, we brought up a lot of ancestors' names. In a most recent ancestor was Chief Dan George. So let me sing one line of his song to honor his attention, because when he hears his name, he is going to be alert as to why he heard his name. You want to get the drum up there? Have you met Chief Dan George when you were a young man? No?
No.
Maybe he was just a kid when he was. If we can just sing, just say a few words in our language so that the ancestors that we called upon who paid attention to us know that this is a closed floor now.
Si Haichka Makwa Sashla Atiak Ayas. Nils Jai Tia, Nils Jai at a swam, Nistlit a swam, the Quilnuckle, Atias Nat, Ukhat, a swam, it's a Jai at a Skolalno, it's a Saalo. So, thank you everybody for listening to the conversation tonight about the clams, and just a message to the old ones that this work here tonight is about lifting up the traditional foods that we love and doing it for the old people.
Thank everyone who was here. We appreciate all of the interest and the healers. Each one of you that have ears for this kind of medicine are healers in your own way. Even if you wonder what can I contribute, you have contributed tonight. Aishka.
It's Nat. Good night.
It's not.